Alien girl became my maid by law, but she started acting more like a wife. The air in the mining colony was always thick with dust, carrying the taste of metal and stone that clung to the tongue long after a shift was over. James' heart knew it well, for he had spent half his life beneath those choking tunnels, cutting at rock, listening to the groan of machines and the constant thrum of drills. His body bore the marks of that labor, broad shoulders scarred from falling stone, hands calloused and rough, and eyes that had grown used to the dim lights of the underground world. When the shift siren finally wailed its release, he climbed out of the tunnels with the rest of the miners, his face streaked with grime. Others laughed and joked, trying to shake off the weight of another day, but James walked in silence, his long strides carrying him to the edge of the colony. He was not like them. He did not gather at the canteen. He did not join in card games or share drinks in the neon-lit halls. He had learned long ago that attachments in a place like this only ended in pain. But when he pushed open the door to his quarters, he was reminded that he no longer lived alone. She was waiting there, standing as if carved from stone, her hands folded neatly before her. Her name was Sariel. Her presence filled the room before she even spoke. She was tall for her kind, her frame slender yet strong, her dark hair falling like a curtain around her shoulders. Her skin bore faint silver markings that shimmered under the artificial light, patterns of heritage that once carried honor among her people but now meant nothing here. And her eyes, gray, sharp, unyielding, met his with the same cold judgment every evening. She wore the ceremonial maid attire, the pale cloth cut and sewn to resemble submission, though to her kind it was nothing less than humiliation. The law demanded it. Every human in the colony was assigned one of the natives as a maid, a cultural guide meant to preserve peace between species. In truth, it was little more than enforced servitude. James had never wanted one. He had argued, shouted even, that he needed no maid, no watchful alien shadow haunting his home. But the council had been clear. The law was not optional. "Your meal is ready," Sariel said, her voice precise and clipped, each word chosen with care. James brushed past her without answering, dropping his gear onto the worn bench. His muscles ached, and dust still clung to his lungs, but he would rather endure that than the sharp edge of her voice. Sariel watched him silently, her posture stiff, her tone formal when she spoke again. "The water was rationed. I saved enough for you to wash." He gave her nothing more than a nod, walking toward the small basin in the corner. He wanted to tell her she did not need to serve him. He wanted to remind her that he had lived alone for years before she came, and he could live alone again. But every time he tried, the words caught in his throat, strangled by the knowledge that she had no choice in this arrangement either. And so, silence stretched between them, night after night. But James noticed things. Small things. The way her hands were not soft as he expected from someone given the title of maid. They were rough, hardened, marked with the same calluses that he himself bore. She had worked before, labored in ways her people rarely admitted. When she thought he was not listening, she hummed low, haunting notes that reminded him of old earth songs buried in recordings he had kept hidden. Once, he had paused in the doorway, listening as her voice rose gently, carrying a sorrow that mirrored his own. And Sariel, for all her coldness, noticed him too. The way he never barked commands like other humans. The way he shared food, leaving portions for her even when he claimed he was not hungry. The way he repaired broken tools that others discarded, giving life back to scraps that had no use. She had expected cruelty or arrogance. What she found instead was a man weighed down by loss, yet unwilling to make another carry his burden. In those first days, contempt was their shield. Every word sharp, every glance full of disdain. But contempt, like armor, began to crack with use. And beneath it, something else waited, patient and unspoken. The days that followed were heavy with tension. Sariel moved through James's quarters with the precision of a soldier, each motion calculated, each word spoken with the formality of duty. She cleaned, she prepared meals, she maintained order. But she did so with the same cold distance as one forced into a role she despised. James ignored it at first. He had no patience for arguments, no energy for battles that could never be won. He let her speak, let her act, and then retreated into silence. Yet even silence could not mask the sharp edges of her presence. Every glance carried judgment. Every pause in her voice held contempt. But in the cracks of routine, James noticed glimpses of something different. Once, he returned early from the tunnels, stepping quietly through the doorway. Sariel had not heard him enter. She was at the small table, hands busy with scraps of fabric she had gathered. She hummed softly, a tune unfamiliar yet haunting, her voice fragile in the stillness. It carried the weight of loss, of exile, of longing for something beyond stone walls. James stood frozen, not wanting to break the moment. But when she sensed him, her voice fell silent, her eyes hardening again into cold gray steel. Another time, he caught sight of her hands as she carried a basin. They were not the delicate hands of a servant, but the rough hands of a worker, scarred with old burns and cuts. Her people had cast her into this life, he realized, not because she was weak, but because she was strong in ways they could not tolerate. She carried the marks of rebellion, though she spoke nothing of it. And Sariel, in her guarded way, began to notice him too. James was not like the other humans she had been warned about. He did not order her around. He did not treat her like an object. When the food rations arrived, he left portions for her without comment, pretending he was not hungry when in truth his stomach growled from the long shifts. When a tool broke, he did not discard it but fixed it, piece by piece, with patience that spoke of someone unwilling to give up on what others called useless. She had been taught that humans were arrogant, greedy, careless. But James' heart was none of these things. He was a man weighed down by grief, perhaps, but not cruel, not unkind. Their world of silence began to shift, almost imperceptibly. A glance that lasted longer than before. A word spoken without the sharp edge of disdain. The faintest hint of curiosity beneath the cold. One evening, after another long shift, James returned to find Sariel waiting with food already set out. He sat across from her, too weary to argue, too tired to eat in solitude. She watched him for a moment before speaking, her voice quieter than usual. "You repair things that others throw away," she said, her eyes fixed on him. James looked up, surprised by her attempt at conversation. "Because broken things still have use. You just have to see it." Sariel tilted her head, her expression unreadable. "Most do not bother. It is easier to discard than to mend." "Easier does not always mean better," he replied, his voice steady but distant, as if he were speaking as much to himself as to her. For the first time, her gaze softened, just a fraction. And though no more words passed between them that night, the silence felt different. Less like a wall, more like a bridge waiting to be crossed. But fate did not allow walls to crumble slowly. The colony was a place of danger, where the ground itself could turn against those who dug too deep. And soon, both James and Sariel would be forced to face what lay hidden beneath their guarded hearts. The mines were alive with sound that day. The groan of metal supports, the grinding of drills, the distant thunder of shifting stone. James had worked these tunnels for years, but he never trusted them. The earth had moods, and when it grew restless, no human machine could hold it back. Sariel had followed him into the shafts, carrying supplies for the crew. It was not her duty, but she had insisted. James had argued, but she had stood firm, her gray eyes daring him to deny her. And so she walked beside him through the narrow passageways, her steps steady, her gaze sharp, as if the earth itself could not intimidate her. The warning came too late. A deep rumble shook the walls, dust falling from the ceiling in choking clouds. Men shouted, dropping tools, scrambling for the exits. The ground split with a sound like thunder, stone collapsing in massive slabs. James barely had time to shove Sariel toward the side tunnel before the world came crashing down. Darkness swallowed them, the air filled with dust so thick it clawed at the throat. The roar of falling stone echoed until it was all James could hear. When at last the rumble faded, he found himself half buried in rubble, his leg pinned beneath jagged rock. Pain flared sharp and hot, but worse than the pain was the silence that followed. "Sariel!" he called, his voice hoarse. For a moment, there was nothing. Then a cough, a ragged breath, and her voice answering in the dark. "I am here." Relief flooded him, though his chest tightened with every breath of dust. He tried to move the stone crushing his leg, but it would not budge. Panic clawed at him. If the air did not run out, the weight would finish him. Then he felt hands on the rock. Sariel's hands. She strained, her body trembling, as she tried to shift the impossible weight. Stone scraped against stone, and with a final cry, she managed to move it just enough for James to drag himself free. He collapsed beside her, his body bruised, blood seeping from cuts he could not count. The tunnel was sealed. No light, no escape, only the stale, thinning air. They sat together in the dark, their breaths ragged, their bodies pressed close by necessity. James could feel her trembling, though she tried to hide it. "They will dig us out," James said, though he did not believe it. "Perhaps," she answered, her voice low, "but perhaps not." Silence stretched. The weight of unspoken truths pressed heavier than the stone around them. And in that darkness, pride gave way to honesty. "I feel like nothing," James whispered, his voice breaking, "a cog in their machine. If I die here, no one will remember me. No one will care." Sariel turned her head toward him, though he could not see her face. Her voice was steady, but filled with something deeper than formality. "My people cast me out because I questioned the old ways. I am nothing to them, an outcast, a servant dressed in shame." Her hand found his in the dark. At first he stiffened, and used to the warmth of touch. But then his fingers closed around hers, holding tight as if it were the only thing keeping him tethered to life. "If this is the end," he said quietly, "then I do not want to face it alone." Her grip tightened, and for the first time, her voice softened to a whisper. "Not while I am here." They sat together, two souls abandoned by the worlds that birthed them, bound now by the fear of death and the fragile comfort of shared truth. And just when hope had nearly faded, a sound pierced the silence. The sharp clang of tools against stone. Voices calling through the rubble. Light breaking through cracks in the wall. The rescue team tore their way in, pulling James and Sariel into the harsh glow of lanterns. The others saw only two survivors, dusty and bruised. But James and Sariel knew the truth. Something had shifted in that darkness. Something that could not be undone. Life in the colony did not pause for near-death experiences. The drills resumed, the overseers barked orders, and the miners returned to their endless rhythm. But for James and Sariel, something had changed. The silence that once hung between them now carried a different weight. Sariel no longer moved through his quarters like a ghost of duty. She lingered. She set food for two instead of one. When James came home with dust in his lungs and pain in his shoulders, she was there. Not with sharp words, but with quiet presence. She sat across from him at meals, no longer retreating once her task was done. One evening, he found her seated by the old recorder he kept hidden in a corner. It was a relic from Earth, filled with songs of another age. Her fingers hovered over the device, uncertain, until James gave her a nod. The soft notes of an Earth ballad filled the room, and to his surprise, Sariel began to hum along. Her voice wove into the melody as if she had known it all her life. For James, it was the first time his home had felt alive in years. But the walls of a colony were thin, and whispers traveled faster than dust. The alien maid spends too much time with the miner. She sits at his table. She acts more like a wife than a servant. Laughter followed these words in the halls, cruel and mocking. Humans sneered at James, calling him weak for letting an alien shadow his steps. Some asked openly if he had forgotten his own kind. Others jeered, whispering that no human woman would have him, so he clung to the scraps of another race. Sariel faced her own torment. Among her people, eyes followed her with venom. Old women spat at her feet. Younger ones muttered traitor under their breath. The maid attire she wore, already a humiliation, now became a symbol of betrayal. And through it all, she endured, her head high, her steps unbroken. But the tension grew, until one day it reached the ears of the Alien Council. They summoned her, demanding an explanation. She stood before them in the grand chamber, her gray eyes steady as they leveled accusations. "You are meant to serve, not bond," one elder hissed. "You disgrace your heritage," another declared. "You forget your duty to your people." Sariel did not bow her head. She stood tall, her voice clear. "I have not forgotten. I was cast aside by you long before I entered his home. I was nothing to you then, and I am nothing to you now. But with him I am seen." The chamber erupted in outrage. Elders slammed their staffs against the floor, voices rising in fury. The council's decision was swift. She would be removed from service immediately and returned to her people in exile. When James learned of it, he felt the same crushing weight as the stone that had once pinned him underground. The overseers warned him to stay out of it. "She is not your concern," they said. "Her kind do not belong to us, and she was never yours to keep." But as James sat in his quarters, staring at the empty space where Sariel once moved, he realized something undeniable. He had spent years convinced he needed nothing but silence. Yet now the silence burned. Now it felt like loss. And when Sariel was led through the colony's streets the next day, bound for exile, James stepped forward. His voice was steady, his shoulders squared. "She is not my maid," he said, his words cutting through the jeers and shouts. "She is my partner." The crowd erupted. Outrage, laughter, disbelief. The overseers warned him again, threatening his work, his rations, his place in the colony. The alien elders spat their fury, demanding silence. But James did not back down. For the first time in years, he refused to bow to the weight of the world. He walked to Sariel's side, taking her hand in his, and together they stood before both races, human and alien alike. And in that single act, something broke that could never be mended. The moment James took Sariel's hand, the colony erupted into chaos. Shouts filled the square, anger spilling from both sides. Humans cursed him for disgracing his kind, while aliens called Sariel a traitor who had shamed her people beyond forgiveness. Overseers and elders alike moved to separate them, but neither released their grip. Sariel's voice rose above the noise, sharp and unwavering. "I am not his maid. I am his partner." Gasps rippled through the crowd. To speak those words openly was to defy the law itself. The elders shouted in fury, their staffs striking the ground. The overseers barked warnings, promising punishment. Yet Sariel's eyes did not waver, and James's stance did not falter. The verdict came swiftly. The alien council demanded her exile. The human overseers declared that James had violated colony law, and with it, forfeited his rights to work, rations, and shelter. Together, the ruling was clear. They were banished. The next day, their belongings were thrown into the dust. Tools, scraps, a handful of personal items. Nothing more. James stood at the edge of the colony gates, watching as the doors closed behind him. For years, those gates had been the only world he knew. Now they sealed shut like the end of a life. Sariel stood beside him, the alien sun glinting against the silver markings on her skin. She did not look back. They walked into the wasteland. The land beyond the colony was harsh and unforgiving, a stretch of barren rock and jagged ridges where the wind carried grit sharp enough to sting the skin. But James had survived worse, and Sariel walked as though she had been born for this place. Together, they pushed forward until the colony was nothing more than a distant shadow. By nightfall, they found a hollow beneath the cliffs, a shallow cave that offered shelter from the wind. James set down the few tools he had salvaged, his hands working by instinct to fashion a fire from scraps of fuel and stone. Sariel knelt beside him, arranging her meager supplies of food and water. For the first time since their exile, they paused, breathing in the silence of freedom. "This is not much of a home," James said, his voice rough but steady. Sariel looked at him, her gray eyes softened by firelight. "It is ours. That is more than I had before." They built slowly, piece by piece. James repaired broken machines scavenged from the outskirts of the colony, turning scraps into working tools. Sariel brought knowledge of alien plants, finding hidden patches of hardy vegetation that could be coaxed into food. What they could not buy, They bartered with wanderers and outcasts who drifted through the wasteland. At night, they sat by the fire. James would tell stories of Earth, of oceans that stretched beyond sight, of forests filled with life, of cities lit like stars against the dark. Sariel would answer with tales of her people's old traditions, of skies filled with ships before exile and war fractured them. Sometimes she would hum again, her voice carrying through the night air, and James would listen, his heart no longer heavy with silence. They had lost everything, but in the losing they had found each other. Back in the colony, whispers spread like wildfire. The miner and the maid who had defied both races. The man who had claimed an alien not as a servant, but as a wife. Some mocked, some cursed, but others wondered. Wondered if perhaps the laws were not as unshakable as the council claimed. And in the wasteland, James and Sariel lived not as outcast and maid, not as human and alien, but as two souls who had chosen each other despite the weight of worlds. The days turned into weeks and weeks into months. The wasteland, once a place of exile, slowly became their sanctuary. The cave transformed into a shelter, then into a home. What had begun as scraps and broken tools grew into something far greater. A life built not on law or duty, but on choice. James rose each morning with strength he had not felt in years. The endless drudgery of the mines had once bent his back and hollowed his spirit, but now every strike of his hammer, every repair he made, had purpose. He was no longer laboring for overseers who saw him as little more than a tool. He was building for them, for Sariel, for himself, for the fragile dream they had chosen to share. Sariel flourished in exile. No longer confined to servitude, she moved with a quiet grace that revealed who she truly was. She found plants hidden in crevices, coaxed water from stubborn rocks, and sang her people's songs freely, without fear of being silenced. Her laughter, once rare, became a familiar sound beneath the alien stars. Together they began to draw others. At first it was a wanderer, a broken man who had fled the colony's punishments. Then a small band of alien exiles who had grown weary of bowing to councils that despised them. Slowly, their hollow beneath the cliffs grew into a camp. Shared fires, shared work, shared stories. Humans and aliens, outcasts both, united not by blood or law, but by choice. James never claimed to be a leader, but when disputes arose, people turned to him. When hope faltered, they looked to Sariel. Their defiance had become a spark, and that spark had caught flame. One evening, as the sun sank in crimson fire over the horizon, James sat beside Sariel on the cliff's edge. The camp below bustled quietly, the sound of tools, voices, and laughter echoing into the dusk. "You know," James said, watching the horizon, "when they cast us out, I thought it was the end." Sariel turned to him, her hand brushing his. "It was the end of a life that was never truly yours. This," she gestured to the camp, to the firelight glowing against the stone. "This is the beginning." For a long moment, they sat in silence, the alien wind carrying the scent of smoke and earth. Then James spoke softly, as though to himself. "They thought exile would break us, but they gave us freedom instead." Sariel smiled, her gray eyes shimmering in the fading light. "And in freedom, we found each other." Above them, the first stars appeared, glittering in the endless sky. Stars that belonged to no single race, no single law. Stars that belonged to anyone brave enough to claim them. And beneath those stars, James and Sariel began their new life. Not as human and alien, not as master and maid, not even as outcasts, but as partners, as equals, as the proof that love and defiance could rewrite the fate of worlds. Their story was no longer whispered in anger or scorn. It became legend. The miner and the maid, who had chosen each other when everything else demanded they be apart. The first spark of something greater, something no council or overseer could ever control. A beginning,